welcome to the You Can Ask That event. My name's Bronwyn Cumbo. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the Faculty of Education, and I initiated the You Can Ask That series to give early career researchers an opportunity to learn directly from more experienced academics across the university through this informal style Q&A event. And today's theme is looking at social research methods during the time of COVID-19. So first up, I'd like to introduce our panellists. Our first panelist is Associate Professor Mark Rickinson from the Faculty of Education. So Mark's an experienced educational researcher, evaluator and facilitator who has particular expertise in evidence-informed policy and practice and outdoor and environmental learning. So his research interest lies in understanding and improving the use and usefulness of educational research. So Mark is the primary chief investigator of the Q project, which is exploring how quality use of evidence can be used to improve educational practice. Our second panelist is Dr. Brady Robards, who is a senior lecturer in sociology in the School of Social Sciences. Brady's research sits between the sociology of youth and cultural sociology of digital media. He's interested in how young people use social media and how social media comes to serve as sites of identity work and archival memory constituted through digital traces, and has extensive experience with digital ethnography and social media research methods. And our final panelist is Associate Professor Yolande Strengers, who is a digital sociologist and human-computer interaction scholar, investigating the sustainability and gender effects of digital, emerging and smart technologies. Yolande works with qualitative and digital ethnographic methods, theories of social practice and technofeminism to understand how people, and sometimes their pets, are incorporating new devices and technologies into their everyday lives and homes. Yolande leads the Energy Futures theme in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, which is a cross-faculty initiative through the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture and Information Technology at Monash University. So thank you to our three panellists for taking the time to be here. Mark's going to start this session, so just a reminder to everyone to please add your questions in the chat as we go, and I'll try and get through all these. Thank you.
Thanks, Bronwyn. It's a real pleasure to be here, and good for you for setting this up, because we need all the possible ways to connect at this time. So the context of what I'm going to say, I mean, one of the main research projects I'm involved in at the moment is something called the Q project that Bronwyn mentioned, and we're in the second year of a 5-year project, which is in partnership with the Paul Ramsay Foundation, looking at essentially the use of research evidence in Australian schools. So, you know, this was our year 2 was really the year where we were starting to work much more closely with schools across 4 states. So the COVID crisis has definitely hit us. And so it's kind of in that context, I just wanted to share kind of 3 reflections on the ways in which we've been trying to move forward as social researchers in the time of COVID. So the first thing that I think has been really helpful to us was a conversation that we had kind of towards the end of March with our steering committee. And one of the pieces of advice was just encouragement to kind of hold true to our original objectives. So the comment from one of our steering committee members was, it's really important to be patient and persistent in relation to your objectives, but at the same time, flexible, and adaptable in terms of the timescale, the timing, and the methods towards working towards them. And I just think that, you know, it sounds it is a very simple statement, but it's actually been really helpful for us. And just kind of remembering, going back to, you know, what was this year really about? What were we really trying to do? And then thinking about, okay, how do we flex in order to still move towards that? So for instance, understanding practice has been really important for us this year in terms of not just what does quality use of evidence kind of mean conceptually, which is what we were working on last year, but what does it look like in practice? And we had a survey that had already gone out to teachers across 4 states, and we had actually good uptake of it, even right at the beginning of lockdown across a number of states. And so we've been able to find a way to follow up with rather than doing school visits, but to follow up doing online interviews with teachers and school leaders who'd responded to that survey. And so they'd kind of already taken a step of being involved. And we've been able to begin to build up some quite rich insights into practice in that way. But I think just kind of holding on to your aims is really important. It's like not everything goes out the window. It's more, you know, kind of changing tactics rather than changing goals. The second point, and I think this is important, you know, for me, it's really important in all research, but it's just become so much more important during these recent times, is how the mouthpiece has to turn to become an earpiece. So what's on the slide there, the you know, that kind of often researchers, we're kind of going out trying to tell people what we're about, you know, tell people and talk to people about what we're doing, but it's really about just turning it the other way and really focusing on listening. So we've had to stay really close to our partners in jurisdictions across the states, in professional associations, principal associations, in subjects, you know, any contacts that we've got who can help us to understand what's going on, because the impacts are so different. You know, I was talking to a colleague a couple of days ago who lives literally just a few K outside the Metro Melbourne area, and her kind of work-life experience at the moment is very different from many others who are in Metro Melbourne. And it's the same within schools, you know, in different, because we're working across different states and across different jurisdictions. So really listening hard and trying to understand what's going on for different people who you're looking to work with or who are working with. And we've really had to be just very sensitive and empathetic, and kind of just really like a dance, you know, of really trying to respond to where different people are at, and almost testing things out before we do it, saying, this is what we're planning to do. How does that sound? Do you think that's a realistic ask at this point? And just being willing to make changes quite quickly. The upside of that, though, is it is actually also a real way to kind of build trust and to kind of show that you're serious about responding to participants' needs and partners' needs. That's been significant for us. And then the final thing, I mean, and I'm sure, you know, you're probably sick of hearing this kind of thing, but it's another sort of thing that was said to us, you know, is that really think about the opportunities, not just the risks. And that has been significant. You know, for instance, our move towards doing you know, more kind of digital online type data collection processes has meant that the range of regional and remote schools that we can work with is suddenly much larger, and that's been really positive, and that's kind of, you know, something that will be a real benefit as we move forward into subsequent years in this project. We've also been able to bring forward the kind of scoping and then development of an online community of practice around quality use of research evidence, which we thought we wouldn't get to till later in the project, but that's been something we've been able to sort of initiate earlier on. And I think as well, we've been kind of really trying to think about, you know, what leverage might there be at the moment in relation to the use of evidence in connection with, you know, school leaders and others responding to the COVID crisis. And there have been some connections that we've been able to make. And often that's been about listening to principals and other practitioners around how they're, you know, the sorts of things that they're experiencing and what they need help with. We've realized that there have been kind of connections that we wouldn't have envisaged that we've been able to make between the kind of work we're doing and the challenges that practitioners and people in jurisdictions are experiencing right now. So is that about the right time, Bronwyn?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brady.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and hello to everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to come along to this. It's great, as Mark said, to opportunity to chat and share and I think where Mark started with was a great set of principles that hopefully I can build on by providing a couple of examples from maybe one or two of my own projects. Before I get into that though, I do want to acknowledge and I want to say that what I'm going to say next isn't necessarily a tacit kind of endorsement of us just kind of going ahead and proceeding business as normal. This is a really difficult time for people, ECRs, PhD students, everyone at the moment is really struggling. And I think sometimes just getting out of bed and looking at your email is an achievement. And so if the thought of totally redesigning your research projects and going and doing fieldwork at the moment is overwhelming, that's okay. You're not alone in that. Lots of people feel like that. So I want to acknowledge that and normalize that. But for those of you that do have the capacity to kind of go on and want to think about methods in this kind of context, I can share with you a couple of examples of projects that I'm involved in currently where we've done that. So the first project I'll talk about is a project that we're doing with the federal government looking at young people's experiences of public services. So this was a commissioned research project that's still ongoing, so I can't say too much about it, but I can talk through some of the methods. So the project had 4 pillars of research, I suppose, and basically, as we've come to realize over the project's course over the last few months, it's really 4 projects in one. That was very ambitious at the beginning and still is very ambitious, but the project's 4 pillars were secondary data analysis, focus groups, a national survey, and also social media sentiment analysis. And we designed the project at a time when the world was, as it was before the pandemic. So we had planned to run focus groups, for example, across Australia in regional hubs in different locations. And that, of course, all fell apart, not too long ago. And so we had to radically redesign the project. And I'm one of a big team. I'm one of the co-directors of the project with 7 or 8 CIs, and we have 6 research assistants. So it's a big team. And we very quickly kind of thought, how can we do this in the context of physical distancing? How can we use Zoom, for example, to run focus groups? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We had originally planned to do 30 focus groups around the country with 5 or 6 participants each. But what we realized is that the nature of Zoom, the kind of quality of the dialogue we can have, building rapport, those sorts of issues that you would normally navigate in a focus group were that much more complicated in the Zoom context. Anyone who's been teaching this semester, running meetings, being involved in discussions on Zoom will know that it takes a little bit of time for people to get comfortable, and especially in a focus group scenario where you're talking to young people about sometimes quite challenging issues in their lives, that is sort of intensified. So what we decided to do was shrink the size of the focus group, so move it to 3 or 4 participants each, but scale up the number of the focus groups. So only a couple of weeks ago, we finished those focus groups off. We did it over about 3 months, only because we had that team, the size of that team. We did about 47 focus groups with 155 young people across Australia. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of data to analyze there, to look at. But I suppose a few things that we learned from that, aside from the immediate kind of instincts to change the scope in terms of the number of participants and increase the number of focus groups we were able to do. Some of the things that we learnt along the way was around rapport building. It's obviously much more difficult in a Zoom kind of environment. So spending some time just chatting casually and trying to build up that small talk before we ask people the bigger questions. One of the things we're also worried about that changed over time was the quality of the recording. So because everyone is obviously coming from a different internet connection, we were worried about unevenness there, but Zoom tended to work okay. There were a couple of incidents where people dropped out, and we had 2 facilitators for the first maybe dozen or so focus groups, because we wanted to make sure that if one of the facilitators dropped out, someone was there to jump in. And that was actually good, because there were a couple of times where facilitators dropped out and the recording stopped, and you can imagine the participants just sort of sitting there waiting for the facilitator to come back. So that was one strategy we implemented. We also had planned originally to do kind of butcher's paper, workshopping together, and that obviously wasn't going to work on Zoom. So we switched to digital whiteboards. We had a third-party website initially where people could go and draw together and make notes together on sort of their pathways through adulthood or towards adulthood. But then we actually started using the inbuilt functions in Zoom because that was a bit tidier, and we were able to capture that as we went as well. So I suppose a quick reflection on what is lost versus what is gained through this approach. Certainly it's more challenging to do that rapport building. The kind of cadence and pace of conversations is also a little bit more stilted than you would have in a physical situation. But in terms of what we gained, obviously being able to continue with the project at this time was a bonus, but it also actually allowed us to reach people who otherwise might not have been able to participate. So that was a good bonus for us. We had planned to do focus groups in regional locations, but even then, sometimes getting to a regional hub to participate can be challenging for some people. Some people don't, there are a lot of social anxieties around being in kind of focus groups with people you don't know. So for some people, the Zoom environment was actually a bit more comfortable. So there were those kinds of positives and challenges as well. The other question Bronwyn asked was around looking ahead and thinking about how researchers can adapt their practices. And I think coming back to what Mark said, really listening to participants and thinking about what's going to work for the people you're trying to reach is really important. We had about 700 volunteers for this project, and that was the result of a kind of social media recruitment campaign. And the fact that we had that many volunteers, I mean, maybe it was partly because we were offering them gift cards, right, for their time. So that was an incentive. But also I got the feeling that there were a lot of people at this time that just wanted to talk and connect. And it was very early on in the process, like it was sort of 3-4 months ago now that we started doing that recruitment. And we probably had about a 50% transmission rate from volunteer to actually showing up to a focus group, which is not unusual. But there was just this sense that a lot of the young people we were talking to really just wanted to connect and communicate and talk through their issues, whether it was with public service or with their study or with their current social life, those sorts of things. So I think it's important for us to not underestimate the importance of doing research at this time, not just, to keep our own projects on the go, but there are important voices that need to be heard in this kind of scenario, in this sort of situation. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate that either. Bronwyn, I was going to talk about another method, but I've probably spoken for long enough, so I might leave it there. And if people want to talk more about other things, we can come back to it. The other stuff that I was going to mention was around a method that I developed called the social media scroll back method, which is where you sit with participants and scroll back through their social media histories together. So I can talk more about that if people want to ask about that in question time, but I might shut up for now.
Thanks, Brady. Thanks, Yolande.
Great, thanks for the invitation. And I will obviously also be kind of picking up, I guess, on Mark and Brady's points as well, because there's lots of similarities between what we're doing. I'm actually a digital sociologist, which means I already do work with technologies and study the way people use technologies, particularly in their home. And I'm part of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, which sits across the faculties of IT and Art Design and Architecture. And what our lab is focused on, again, is doing research with emerging technologies, but also using digital methods. So we have a long history, particularly through our director, Sarah Pink, of doing video ethnography and using remote methods and using digital methods with participants. So the adaptation for our lab and for us maybe hasn't been as stark and as difficult as it has been for some others, but obviously lots of experience and to share there in terms of how these methods have already been used for many, many years and how we can kind of reappropriate them in the time of the pandemic. What I wanted to do was, with reference to 2 projects, just go through, I've made a little list based on Bronwyn's question she posed to us for the panel, which is, what is lost and what is gained when adapting our research practices to the new context. So I just wanted to kind of run you through those. And it was an interesting thought experiment actually, because I ended up with a lot more on the gained list than I did on the lost list, which sort of surprised me because, you know, the pandemic is not fun, and we often kind of think of all the horrible things about it rather than the potential gains. So it was a useful exercise for me as well. But I'm going to go through the list in relation to 2 projects we've adapted online. One is a partnership with an aged care provider called McLean Care and Deakin University and ourselves. And Melissa is on the Zoom call today. She's the virtual methods expert on this project and the research fellow who's been working on it with our team. And in that project, we gave a bunch of older people some smart home technologies to try in their homes. These are off-the-shelf devices, robotic vacuum cleaners, virtual voice assistants, smart lights. So this was with a cohort of people who really aren't familiar with and aren't necessarily comfortable with using technology. And we got all this technology into their homes, and we did our first visits right before the first kind of lockdown hit. And we planned to go back to them again in person in regional New South Wales, but of course we couldn't. So we adapted everything online for that project and recontacted them through a variety of online methods to ask them about their experiences with the technologies. So that's one project. And then the second one is a linkage project, an ARC linkage project with some energy companies. And it is looking at how people imagine their futures with digital technologies and energy technologies. It's a much longer term project, but we were just about to start the ethnography before lockdown hit. So just about to go out to 72 homes around Australia and do a bunch of methods with them, to do interviews, to do tours of their homes, to get them to do diaries, you know, a whole range of things. So we've again had to adapt all of that online. We had a 3 or 4 month pause, but then when the second lockdown hit, we were like, no, this is going to go on for too long. So let's go virtual. And we've split it up into a number of different visits now that we'll be doing through Zoom and other online platforms, and also thinking about giving participants GoPro cameras and a bunch of other kind of devices so that they can go and capture some of their experiences about what they're currently doing, and also how they see their futures unfolding in relation to digital technologies in their home. So they're the 2 projects. So now I want to just kind of go through my little list of what's lost and what's gained to kind of start this. This is really meant to be a conversation starter, and also really like to hear your experiences, because in my experience at the moment, the most innovative people in my team who are adapting all their methods online are people like Melissa and my PhD candidates. So I'm kind of learning as much from them, and so as I am from, you know, my experience. And so I think this is a conversation we can all have together as well, rather than seeing us as the experts that you extract something from. I'm sure we can learn from you as well. So what's lost? Well, as Brady mentioned, that rapport is really a lot harder to build particularly when you're going in cold to a new home, as we're doing with the energy project. We don't know these people, you know, we're going in straight away with nothing, and we're going into the most intimate parts of their lives, asking them about, you know, how they heat and cool their homes, how they clean, how they entertain. So that's something that I think we've thought about, you know, and Brady had some tips there about how to do that in terms of just starting off with those easy conversations and those small talk, you know, to start off with. I think you lose a lot of body language, and you can it's difficult to pick up if people are becoming uncomfortable with your questions. So that's something that I think is more challenging. It also can be a bit awkward. So there's not that kind of flow of conversation that, you know, you get when you're sitting at someone's table having a cup of tea and chatting about their life. You lose a lot of context, particularly if you're just on a Zoom call like we are now, and if someone's got a photo up like I do. You know, part of the reason we go to people's homes is to see the context and then ask them questions about what we see around their homes. And so we lose a lot of that, and that we have to kind of find new ways of doing that. And one way we're looking at is the tour that I mentioned before, which will be adapting to people's phones and getting them to walk us around their home with their phone and showing us their home that way. But we're planning that for the second visit because of the issues with the rapport building and all the other stuff that is more challenging, as I mentioned. Also time. I mean, time's an interesting one, but I think firstly, people aren't really prepared to spend as much time on Zoom, and we all know why. We're all experiencing Zoom fatigue, which is difficult with the longer kind of methods that we use in ethnography. but also can take more time. You know, Melissa spent hours, I'm not sure how many hours it was, Melissa, but I know it was a lot, just getting people kind of onto the platforms, figuring out what technologies they need, figuring out how to use the technologies ourselves. And then there's so much more to kind of record, store, you know, there's a whole kind of back end of data management that comes with moving everything online. So there is some lost time there as well. That's my loss list. So on my gained list, paradoxically, there's also a gaining of time. And this has been a really big thing for me this year, because I went into the year thinking I was going to be traveling all around the country and all around the world. And I didn't travel anywhere, just been stuck in my home. I'm not going anywhere, but I've actually quite liked that, to be honest. I know that that's not the case for everyone, and I'm sure, you know, there's also joy and pleasure to be taken from traveling around the country and doing research, but certainly have gained back an enormous amount of time by not, for example, traveling to regional Australia, where we were doing the work with the older people and smart homes. I think it took us, what, 8 hours or something, or 6 to 8 hours each way to get there and back. So, you know, big gains in time from that perspective. New digital experiences is another gain. With the Smart Home Project in particular, what I mean by that is that we've actually got to do research with participants about the technologies we're doing research with them on. So we gave, for example, these older people some tablets to use to do virtual calls with. And then we actually ended up doing virtual calls with them on those tablets, which became part of the research itself. So there was this kind of combination of the research method and the research findings from that project, which I think is a really interesting gain that we wouldn't have had if we'd gone back to them in person. We've gained some budget. I'm not sure this would apply to all of you, but because I imagine you don't have funded research projects like many of us do. But I do think there's an opportunity for early career researchers to think about reappropriating any money you do have. If you have faculty funding, for example, that usually is spent on travel, or if you have PhD money, if you're a PhD candidate through your, you know, through the university, and there's an opportunity to potentially buy equipment that is needed to do virtual fieldwork, as opposed to travel funds. And obviously that depends on what your faculty will fund, but it's an option if it's there. There's an opportunity to create new methods and actually to innovate with methods. And that is now an emerging kind of contribution that we can all have with our work that I think is really, really interesting and something to look into for all of us. There is sort of a couple more left on my list. There's also a unique kind of opportunity created by the pandemic in our research projects, in the disruption it's created. That's actually created a really important moment for us to get people to reflect on their futures for the Energy Futures project, for example, or to reflect on how smart home technologies can support older people to remain connected and not to become socially isolated during the pandemic. So even though, as Brady pointed out, it's not, you know, it's not great, the pandemic, and it has many negative impacts on everybody, it also is a kind of really interesting point to be doing research in and through and with. So I think that's another kind of gain. I'll leave it there, as I think I've spoken long enough, but I can bring in any more if we have time.
Wonderful. Thanks, Yolanda. Thank you, everybody. We've got just under half an hour for the Q&A panel. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat there, and then I'll put it over to you to ask them. I've just got one here from Mike Phillips. That's directed to Mark to start with. Given the changes to the research landscape, what longer term impacts do you envisage for larger research project applications? So for example, do you think reviewers will be interested in requiring contingency plans, methodologies to ensure projects remain sustainable?
Thanks, Bronwyn, and thanks, Mike. Someone once said to me, listen for the answer in the question. And yeah, I think you're right, Mike. I think that will definitely be something where you know, similar to Yolande saying that, you know, disruption provides an opportunity for conversations with people about futures and responses. I think this also helps us as researchers to realise the importance of kind of some of the annoying stuff you have to do around risk management and contingency planning, etc. It actually starts to become more real, and that can be, you know, that can become a very technical type conversation. But I think what's come out from all of the inputs that we've heard this morning is the importance of the relational dimensions of all of this. And so, like, I would be saying that it really brings to the fore the importance of user engagement, of, you know, advisory groups and those sorts of processes within research planning would be another thought that I have.
I had a question just following up on that. Do you think the role of qualitative and quantitative methods is going to shift in terms of its importance and prominence? So this, in terms of funding, but also how we practice research online. And that's just to anybody who wants to pitch in.
I'm not sure yet. Like, I think there's still so much moving stuff happening at the moment that it hasn't really settled. But in terms of the prominence of quantitative versus qualitative, I don't think so. I think there's always a need for you know, a healthy mix of those approaches. And I don't know, I've been hearing people talk about doing away with the kind of quant versus qual thing a lot as well. Like, I do a lot of work in kind of social media space, and people talking about big data and how the meaning making that comes from big data is really done in qualitative ways. So I'm not sure about that. It's a good question. I don't know where it's going to go, though. I don't know whether the pandemic modulates it or not, or whether it's just kind of a longer trajectory around those approaches.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question as well. And I like Brady, I'm not sure that it will affect the balance of qualitative or quantitative or how we think about that. But I do think it will normalize these virtual methods that we're all using. And they'll I mean, they've already been used, as I was saying, when I was starting, you know, for many years already, and there's established fields in virtual methods. Now they're kind of being used as a backup or a second best option for many of us. But I think that may change, just like Zoom, you know, Zoom's kind of like the second rate option to all meeting in person, but some of that will not necessarily all go back the way it was. Like when we are able to meet in person again, will we all go back to face for everything, or will some go back to face and some go back to Zoom? I think that's the same kind of question for methods. You know, will everything just go back to the way it was before the pandemic? Probably not. Probably there will be more applications or more circumstances where we use virtual methods by choice because we think they're actually the best methods for whatever it is that we're doing, rather than just a response to a crisis that's currently happening.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a small enough group here now that people can just pipe up with their questions if you'd like to raise your hand, so there's more of a discussion. I'll just start with, I'll just read one from Alex so we can get going, but after that, please, just so we can have everyone's voices heard. Alex Gower is interested to hear about your social media scroll back. Brady.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an easy question. I didn't run out of time, so thanks for that. Yeah, so the social media scrollback method, I developed it with a colleague of mine, Sean Lincoln, and we started a project that's now completely finished and was published as a book just a couple of months ago, called Growing Up on Facebook. And basically what we did is we sat with participants in an interview scenario and scrolled back with them through their own social media timeline. So we used Facebook for this project, but we've since modified it with Instagram and other platforms for other projects. And essentially it involved this kind of pre-section where we sort of talked to them about social media, and then the scroll back method proper. And it was really about understanding how disclosure practices changed over time. So what people post online, how that changed over time, both as they grew up and also as the platforms changed. So we wanted to understand the kind of backstage work, to use a kind of Goffman-esque sort of term, to understand how the thought processes that went into deciding on what to post or not. And it was, we interviewed people in their 20s who had been on Facebook for 5 or more years. It was usually closer to 8 or 9 or 10 years. And it was really about getting at a sense of how their own social media histories, how they understood their own social media histories. Like, did they look back on their, 15, 16-year-old selves and cringe, or was it kind of like a nostalgic experience? And it was all of those things, as you can imagine. And we were also interested in what was sort of left unsaid and what stuff was erased later as they were sort of moving into professional careers or thinking about their relationships in different ways. Did they kind of go back and change what they had posted? So that's what that method was about. And we've since modified it to have different scales to it. So we've used it in some colleagues and I used it in a drinking cultures project. So to understand how people thought about risky drinking practices, we went back to their social media posts and used images of drinking events to prompt discussion. So it was kind of like a bit of photo elicitation and sort of journal work, but applied retrospectively. So like Yolande said, so many of these methods have existed for a long time, and it's really, this pandemic is actually making people think critically about their methods, and rather than just defaulting to the interviews, focus groups, observational work that might be traditional, people are now being a bit more innovative and open to these different kinds of methods. So we've seen some people ask more about how to use this kind of method in a distance situation where people might be screen sharing and scrolling back through their own social media with a researcher as a way to prompt reflections on music scenes or their own family work, like how family histories are made. So we've seen the method kind of picked up and applied in different contexts. But yeah, that's a bit of a crash course on it. I can certainly link you, Alexa, to some writing we've done on it if that would be helpful.
Yes, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to put a question forward?
I'm Jacka, it's Lisa Hunter here. Sorry about no visual, internet popping in and out. My question was around, the ethics of using visuals hasn't really progressed much for a long time, but given how much social media uses visual practices and the use of visual practices, I'm just wondering if there's been any inroads that I haven't picked up on in both the ethics of using visuals, but also in being able to reproduce and cite, rather than going through, what can become quite a long train of getting permissions for instance, let's say a snapshot of a Google image page to anyone.
I can go first if you like. I think there's, the ethics around using visual material, and especially when we're talking about social media posts that were made not with the intention of being part of a research project, but so say I'm doing an interview with a 25-year-old and we're looking at their 16-year-old selfies, right? Like, so selfies that they took when they were 16. What's the sort of ethics there? And so with the social media scrollback method that we talked about before, we didn't use any of the visuals. We just kind of asked them to narrate and explain as if they were explaining a photo album. So we used the transcripts. We didn't use the visuals for that project. But then for subsequent ones, we did actually ask people to take screenshots of things that they were comfortable with. So there was a kind of tiered process of consent there. We initially said to them in the consent process, the informed consent package, you might be asked to take screenshots, and if you're not comfortable with that, that's fine. And then so we asked them to do it if they wanted to or not. And then the third step was whether or not they actually sent them to us. And we might send a reminder and say, those screenshots you took on your own phone or on your own device, if you're comfortable sending some of them or all of them to us, that would be great, but no pressure. So there was a kind of tiered multiple kind of points of consent, I suppose, around the sharing of those visuals in that context. I guess there's a bigger question, and that's the kind of the method that we use, but there's a kind of other set of ethics around using social media posts that weren't collected as part of research at all. So for example, scraping data, or whether it's tweets or posts on Reddit or Instagram or other platforms, and it's just a kind of de-identification process, and that's a whole other set of ethics. And there is a literature on this. There's the Association of Internet Researchers has an ethics guide. It's not really a kind of formal formula, but it is a set of questions that researchers can ask themselves, which I would encourage you to have a look at. But there's a whole literature around social media research ethics that I'm happy to direct you to, Lisa, if you're interested. But yeah, Mark or Yolande might have more insights on that.
Not really my area. I've had what we're doing with images at the moment is very much participant generated. So the project that Melissa and I are working on with the older people and smart home technologies, we've taken a lot of footage and a lot of photos of their homes themselves, their technologies, their pets. And that's just an ongoing process of consent. So Melissa in particular has been sort of regularly checking in with them about what they're comfortable with having and being used. I think, yeah, the social media side of things, I think you've covered off on that, Brady. That's my understanding as well.
Yeah, and I've done the work with, where it's really contained, it's the individual and the tiered consent form, but it's more where there's stuff that's publicly available, but sourcing who actually owns the image. And it's a bigger research environment question, I guess, because I know I was on a committee many years ago trying to work this through with ethnography, just where visual citation should start and finish, because we can cite people's words, no worries, but citing visuals and one example that I just gave around a Google image that has 50 images on the page, and I just could not get consent because Google expected me to get every individual image permission. So that was just a nightmare. So I just wondered whether the field generally around visual ethics has engaged with that, because I've sort of dipped out of it for a year or two.
I think it's very much ongoing, Lisa. Yeah, it's a big set of questions, and it comes back to whether it's like individual consent or whether it's about intellectual property. And so there are two kind of legal processes there, I think, as well. So I think it depends on the perspective and the kind of research project as well.
Great. Does anyone else have another question?
So mine is about, so I'm very curious about, as Brady said at the beginning, this is not business as usual. So we're still conducting research, and I wonder if these aspects of normal behavior that you're finding in your different research projects, do you think that they hold in a different world, or do you think this is human behavior in pandemic conditions?
Yeah, I could jump there, Beatrice. That's a great question, because we've really been thinking a lot about that, because obviously we're interested in kind of teachers and school leaders' uses of different kinds of information, where they source things, how they assess things, and then the ways in which it's used. Yeah, I guess initially we were, like everyone else, Yolande said this, we were kind of imagining we could pause certain things for a while and then go back to normal, so to speak. But, that's, for everyone's been blown out the water. And I think that's not just, you're right, it's not just about how you do your research, it's also about the what of the research. And I think we're really just beginning to work that through. Beatrice, and I think that will probably, you know, really when you say it like that, that will probably be a very important focus for conversation, both, you know, in actual formal data collection, but also in, you know, all the informal relational work that goes on with people around getting data collection set up, and so yeah, I think that's just a real ongoing question for us, but it's a really important question to be asking.
I could say a little bit about our projects. I mean, it is a great question, and I think it depends on who you're doing research with and what it is that what your research questions are. And the two projects I've mentioned today that we're working on at the moment, I think have quite different answers to that question. So the one with older people, where we gave them smart home technologies, I don't think the pandemic has really impacted that project, you know, significantly, and Melissa can disagree with me if she wants or contribute to this. But what we found with that project, interestingly, is that the older populations are actually already experts in social isolation, and we're talking about people kind of over the age of 70 here. They're already fairly self-sufficient. And while they have had, obviously, still had impacts on their lives, it was more of an extension of what they were already doing than, you know, a massive upheaval, because these aren't people who are, you know, working regularly or studying or, you know, doing those other kinds of things. They're retired, and the main impact was on being able to see their families. But for some of them that already existed anyway, because they didn't necessarily live next to, you know, with or near their families. So I think that one, you know, the pandemic was there, but it wasn't kind of the main thing that kind of came through with that project during the pandemic. With the one with asking people about their energy futures, the other project, I think the pandemic is much more significant, because what it's done is actually accelerate a whole lot of digital and energy trends that the digital and energy sectors think are coming. For example, working from home, caring from home, entertaining ourselves at home. These are all trends that the digital tech and energy sectors have been saying are coming, you know, VR in our homes, and everybody, you know, using Zoom and working from our laptops. So that the pandemic then is I think a really great focus point for that project, and will be useful in helping people to think about what comes next in their futures, which is really what the project's about. So I think for that project, the pandemic is a disruption that will help us understand, help people and help us understand the future. But of course, the results of what are happening now are also really relevant and very much clouded by the circumstances of the pandemic, as opposed to, you know, normal life, whatever that was and will become.
Is there any other questions to put to the panel?
I have a question. It's about rapport building, and affordances versus losses came up, I think, across all three folks. And I'm wondering, have you thought about going forward when it is possible to meet in person? Because I know there's some really important and generative aspects around rapport building and being physically together, but there's also issues highlighted of access and equity and so on. Have you thought about what you're planning to keep from this time versus what you are looking forward to in terms of the return to more physical interactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, like Yolande said before, there's so much that I think we will keep from this time, like as much as there have been losses. The idea of, you know, kind of offering Zoom focus groups, for example, as an option to people who would feel more comfortable contributing that way, may be a way to get at groups of people, or to include voices that would otherwise not want to participate or not be comfortable participating. So I think that's a real positive. I was also thinking about, not necessarily about research methods per se, but about research community more generally around conferences, and how for a long time there's been discussions about, you know, the sort of ethics of conferences with travel and spending money and, you know, carbon footprint, those sort of things. And I wonder about, like, the two of the big conferences that I go to have switched to doing online stuff this year. I don't know if anyone goes to the ICA, the International Communications Association. I don't know, it was not a great experience for me, like just watching people present their papers like to themselves in there. It wasn't a great experience. And the Association of Internet Researchers this year is doing a different kind of thing where it's online, but they're only 2 to 3 minute videos where people are giving presentations like that. And the sort of replicating the social aspect of conferences, I really miss that, like being with colleagues and friends in those sort of contexts, of course. But having said that, you know, the carbon footprint that's been saved, you know, the way that ECRs and people that can't otherwise afford to travel have been included, like there's obviously massive gain. So if there's some way that we can do this sort of bridging work in those sort of academic conference spaces, I think we can take that same approach of, yeah, the way we use methods can be some kind of hybrid form, I think, can have a bit of best of both worlds. But that's easier said than done. Like, I wouldn't want to be organizing a massive conference with, you know, 500, 1,000 plus people right now. It would be a nightmare, I think. But hopefully we can learn stuff from this.
I can add something there too. I mean, the people that I'm most concerned about at the moment with the research we're doing are the ones that we're missing it. And they're the ones that aren't comfortable with using digital technologies in their everyday lives already. The people who aren't using Zoom, don't have access to reliable internet, don't have, you know, digital skills. Maybe they're older generations, maybe they're from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, maybe they're low income, and they're often the people that we really need to be doing research with, particularly in the kind of research I do around energy consumption. They're a really important group. So that is something that we're concerned with that going completely digital. And I guess the only way that we can get around that at the moment with the COVID situation is to offer people many different platforms. So when we're doing our recruitment, if they say they don't have Zoom, or if they say they don't know how to use Skype or whatever, that's not going to be the stopping point for us. We would go to a landline, for example, if that's all they have. And so we try, you know, and then obviously that creates more complexity for us, and we have to adapt things whether we're just doing a video, a voice call versus, you know, some of the more complicated methods that we've talked about. But yeah, that's kind of how we're dealing with it in the COVID world. But post-COVID, ideally, they're exactly the kinds of people that I think would still be really important to capture through face-to-face methods.
Great, thanks, Yolande. I just had one question to finish off. Are there any examples of good practice that you've seen elsewhere that you'd recommend that we research and have a look at?
I'd just say I found today just hugely stimulating, you know, and helpful, because I think we're all just trying to work through this. And yeah, definitely going to be thinking about, you know, Yolande was saying, you know, digital sociologists and researchers have been using these sorts of methods for a long time. And so, yeah, I haven't got any other good examples to add, just to say this has been fantastically helpful in that respect.
Great, thanks, Mark.
So I was going to add that there is, I mean, just going back to what I kind of said at the beginning, that there are a lot of books in this area. There's 2 books that I know of on digital sociology, pre-pandemic. There's a number of books on virtual methodologies, on video ethnography, on digital ethnography. There's also a lot of work from, I think it's more sort of STS, on creative and vibrant methods, and a lot of them use digital kind of methods as well. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can kind of go to that could be either adapted, or some of it doesn't even need to be adapted to the COVID world. So that would be my suggestion. But yeah, I've also really enjoyed the conversation, and it's, yeah, great to hear from everybody as well.
Yeah, likewise, I think today's been really useful. And there was another session that happened a few weeks ago. TASA, as I mentioned, runs those, the Australian Sociology Association runs these regular check-ins, and they did a session on digital methods, and a few people, Crystal Abedin, Shanti Robertson, a colleague of mine, Ben Lyle, and Akane Kanai, who's in media studies here at Monash, contributed, and there was a bunch of resources that came from that. So I might post the link to that YouTube recording, which also has links in the description as well for people who want to find more. Because I think, yeah, Yolande's right to point us to, there's such a long, well, not very long, but, you know, like for the last 20, 30 years, people have been doing really innovative digital research methods in sociology, in media studies, in anthropology, in all different areas, in education. And so I think, yeah, taking more notice of that is really important, because there's a whole history. We don't have to reinvent the wheel with the methods that we're thinking about now. There's a lot of work out there. And sometimes it's just about being open and yeah, finding those good parts. So yeah, it's been a great discussion. Thanks for having us, Bronwyn, rather.
Well, thank you. It's 11 o'clock, so we'll end there. And thanks to everyone for joining, and a huge thanks to our panelists for their stimulating discussion. It's been wonderful. Thank you all. Enjoy your day.